to be here. Thank you very much, Robin, and thank you to everyone in the department for organizing this. My very proud Concordia journalism graduate and former lecturer there too. I was teaching there for a couple of years. It's good to be back. I miss home, especially in this pandemic year. So it's good to see and hear from faces in Montreal. So I'll just start by telling a little bit about what I've been doing recently, and then lead into some lessons of political coverage that I've learned over several years here, and also just observations on the United States and about journalism more generally. So a few weeks ago, I was standing in front of the U.S. Capitol, which was covered in a haze of tear gas and smoke. Next to me, there was a group of people praying and crying because they feared that Donald Trump might not remain president, and they were praying for some sort of intervention that would keep him in office for 4 more years. A man walked in front of me with a Confederate flag. Subsequently, there are pictures of him in the building carrying that Confederate flag. And a man who looks like him has been arrested and accused of breaking into the building. People were wearing tactical outfits, speaking on walkie-talkies, threatening to come back to the building with weapons next time. I heard people sharing the wildest, most deranged conspiracy theories. People were talking about executing Mike Pence under the impression created by QAnon type theories that he's abetting some sort of satanic child-eating cabal of pedophiles in the United States government. So this is all going on around me. And that they wanted him executed by a military tribunal. And so these are folks who actually do believe, people who are around me at this point think that the election truly has been stolen, and they want to steal it back. And they're 100% convinced that this thing's been rigged by the Chinese government in consultation with 6 states, swing states, abetted by Republican and Democratic officials in all these states, and that everyone's in on it, including the elites, including the media, and the courts, the justice system. And they're going to storm the U.S. Capitol, and they're going to stop it in their mind. So I'm sitting in this place, standing in this place, watching this and thinking, how the hell did we get here? How did we get to this place? So I'd like to talk about that. But first, I'll begin with a description of how I personally got there, because I do recall being a student at Concordia and liking hearing stories of other journalists about, how their career path took them to what they were doing and where they were. And here's a little bit about my own personal path and what led me to Concordia, led me to Capitol that day. My own personal experience at Concordia seems like it was only yesterday, but really it was a quarter of a century ago, and it goes by like this. And for me, that journey, like a defining moment in that journey, started on a day in, I believe it was January of 1997, when someone from the Link newspaper came to one of our classrooms and handed out a series of boxes, a bunch of different topics that we might or might not be interested in writing about. And they asked us to check whatever boxes we were interested in, whatever topics we might want to write about. And I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I said, I kind of like this, and I kind of like that, and I kind of like that. And I checked, if I recall correctly, every box on the page. And I got a phone call a lot sooner than I would have expected. I got a call 2 days later from someone in the sports section at the Link saying, would you like to write a story for us? Would you want to interview Concordia student Cami Granato, who was a U.S. Olympic athlete? And I don't remember if she won a gold medal at the previous Olympics or a silver. Anyway, and I was very happy to meet an Olympic athlete and Concordia student and write about hockey. So I said, sure, of course. Wrote the story. A couple of days later, sports editor tells me, well, I'm graduating this year. Would you like to be the sports editor next year? I said, okay, sure, no problem. And this is one thing that struck me relatively early is sometimes you imagine barriers that aren't even there. I didn't know it would be that, that the newspaper was so hungry for new voices and that it would have been that easy to get published. And frankly, I did get published pretty easily. And before I knew what had hit me, I was the sports editor at the Link the next year. And in the process of doing that job, I spoke with someone who knew people at the West Island newspaper, used to exist, doesn't anymore, the Chronicle, and told me that they were looking for sports writers and that they would, that could be a part-time job if I was interested. And I started doing that, and ended up getting a job at the Chronicle full time eventually. And basically, a turning point in my own life came when one of the people who wrote at the Chronicle went to meet his future wife in England, and said, "Well, while I'm gone, would you like to do some freelancing for the Canadian Press to cover some Expos games, baseball games?" And I said, "Sure." And so I started covering the occasional Expos game, and told people I was interested in more than sports. I like news as well. And I got a weekend job at the Canadian Press, and that ended up parlaying into a Quebec City correspondence role. Now, that experience in Quebec City was interesting. It started on January 11th, 2001. And the reason I remember that day is my assignment was to cover the lead up to what was at the time assumed to be the third Quebec referendum on independence. It was always an assumption that it might happen again. And my role was to go there and cover Lucien Bouchard's march toward an independence referendum. Well, Lucien Bouchard resigned from office 4 hours into my first shift. So I get there on January 11th in the morning. My shift starts, I guess, at 9 or something. He's gone at 1 p.m. And so it was a lovely couple of years in Quebec City, but the story that I had anticipated I would cover never ended up happening. But I did end up getting a reputation as kind of a career angel of death, because so I went from covering Lucien Bouchard, quitting on my first day. I was sent to cover a federal liberal caucus retreat in Shawinigan a year later. And I was nervous. I'd never covered federal politics before. And my second day, I believe, on that assignment, Jean Chrétien, Prime Minister at the time, says he's retiring. So basically, everywhere I go, the person I'm covering says that they're leaving politics, and so that assignment apparently went well enough that I was asked to come and join the Canadian Press Bureau in Ottawa, and I spent 6 very happy years in Ottawa, and then moved back home to my favorite city in the world, Montreal, where I was the editor of the Canadian Press Quebec Bureau based in Montreal. And then came to Washington, and where it's been a fascinating few years. So I've covered 2 presidential elections and several party conventions, and just watched an era of head spinning change. To go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden, and to see the political culture of this place evolve rapidly, and assumptions of what could happen and what was possible in this place changed so drastically within a few years. It's been an amazing assignment. Frankly, just even speaking of head spinning change, just watching Joe Biden's rise from being essentially dead in the water. Last February, I was in South Carolina, and I saw him go from being, I think, in 3rd or 4th place in the Democratic nomination race to being the front runner within a couple of days. And that was one of the most amazing experiences. But one of the things I've heard from those crowds in South Carolina and elsewhere was the degree to which Donald Trump was the animating force of American politics. How people on the Democratic side were so desperate to win this election, partly to enact a Democratic agenda, but primarily to stop this president. And I've never seen that kind of devotion to a politician. I think arguably this is the one who comes closest. The ones who come closest would have been Barack Obama, Lucien Bouchard in Quebec City. But the intensity, the passion of these rally crowds, and the things that these people are willing to do for him, I think we've just recently realized the lengths to which people would go for this person. And so that was striking. But the thing that my takeaway after it's been 6 years now, 7 years that I've been in the United States, is the diversity of this country. And obviously, I think people understand you don't view the U.S. as a monolith. It's not all red. It's not all blue. It's a lot more interesting than that. It's an interesting place. And I think some of the texture of this country comes out when you head to specific types of places. And one of those places is Appalachia. I want to sort of tell a story about this place, which I think actually to me was very revealing about why American politics is evolving the way it is. And so I went when Barack Obama instituted a series of changes, regulatory changes on climate change, including some that could potentially phase out dirtier fossil fuel industries like coal, for instance. I found this place that celebrates coal. There's a coal parade every year in a county, Boone County, I believe, in West Virginia, near the border with Kentucky. And I went to cover this event, this annual event where they celebrate coal. And I spoke with people who mined coal, people from the unions and people from the city hall. And I had this really interesting conversation with one particular guy. And he said to me, he was a coal miner. And he said, I voted for Obama in 2008, and I didn't in 2012. And one thing to keep in mind about this region, Appalachia, which basically stretches from New York State down to Kentucky, it basically splits Ohio in half. It's Western Pennsylvania, Ohio. This region was heavily Democratic for forever, right? Very populist economics, progressive economics. It's the home of the U.S. union movement. There were literally wars over unionization. People died. There were killings over the right to unionize. And so this place voted for the Democrats forever. And over the last generation or so, it's really trended towards the Republican Party. And that's one of the reasons that Trump won Ohio twice. It's the reason he won Pennsylvania once and almost won it a second time. It's really that strip between Ohio and Pennsylvania, right? And it continues all the way down to West Virginia, Kentucky. So I'm having this conversation with this gentleman, and he tells me, yeah, I voted for Obama once, and I not in 2012. I decided not to. I said, so why? And he says, well, I thought he was supposed to represent both sides. So sorry, both sides. What do you mean? So he looks at my tape recorder to see whether I'm rolling tape, and I am, recording. But he wanted to. I guess maybe he wanted to talk about it off the record, but he continued anyway. And he said, Barack Obama's mom was as white as you and me, and I thought he was going to represent both of us, black and white. I said, come again? What do you mean? And in his worldview, the Obama agenda represented cities, and cities equaled minorities versus whiter rural places. And what he meant basically was during the week, you're regulating coal, you're regulating fossil fuels, you're hitting me where I work. On the weekend, you're trying to institute gun control, which is hitting me where I go skeet shooting, and this could be a distortion of what Obama's promising, but this is the worldview, right? By putting in background checks or trying to regulate semi-automatic weapons, you're trying to interfere with my leisure time after you've interfered with my work time during the week because you're doing the bidding of the cities. This is the way he sees it. And so what that conversation and the conversations I had there did for me is it helped crystallize for me that politics is moving to a place that's not economic, right? It's about identity. It's about where you fit in the world, and that there's a deep polarization in this country based on culture, based on race, and it has very little to do with taxation rates and trade or what you would consider deep public policy. It's, are you one of us or are you one of them? And that is a very, very toxic and very, very destructive force in politics because it basically pours fuel on every conversation. And I saw that. This event that I'm describing was about 5 years ago or so, 6 years ago. And this last election, I went out to another purple county, Kent County, Michigan. And I just saw the force that this kind of politics had taken on and how it was potentially a corrosive and existential, a corrosive development in the country's politics and an existential threat to it. I went to Kent County because it was kind of a traditional Republican county, but kind of the home of Gerald Ford, kind of progressive Republican. I guess what you call them progressive conservatives in Canada. It was kind of the less culturally combative Republicanism, right? And it was still leans Republican, but not totally. Voted Democrat for the 2018 Michigan governor's race. Voted, I believe, for Obama once, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, it was right in the middle. And so, it's a place where I saw a Black Lives Matter sign on a house next to a Confederate flag. Like the next door neighbor had a Confederate flag. And that's fascinating to me because you don't see that in most of the United States. I live in Washington, D.C. You will not see a Confederate flag in Washington, D.C. It just won't happen. You'll see lots of Black Lives Matter signs. There are other parts of the country where you'll see lots of Confederate flags and no Black Lives Matter signs. But this particular place, this little purple county, was fascinating to me because you have both, and you have these people living next to each other and having to coexist. So I got out of the car at one point because I saw a Black Lives Matter sign next to a Trump sign on a downtown street. And I thought it would make for a cool picture to illustrate my story about this purple county. I get out of the car and I see this guy agitated on the sidewalk. And I say, what's going on? And he's the one with the Trump sign. He says, I'm going to march across the street and I'm going to tell that guy off. I said, come again? And his neighbor, it's a barber shop, and the employees in there, the owner of the shop, are Black, and he's white. And I asked him what's going on, and basically it's this story. It's a long story about gentrification in the neighborhood, white folks moving in, some tension between him and his neighbor, some mutual accusations, neighborly accusations that turn into kind of a race thing. He tells me that, he's afraid for his life if Joe Biden wins because there's going to be race wars. And I'm like, and he's a QAnon conspiracy theory believer. And I say to myself, well, we are completely off the rails here. Like this is not the politics of the United States that I thought I knew 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. And there's nearly a fist fight. And I ended up writing a story about this entire community just one day in this town. This near fight between these two folks. I went and met the head of the Democratic Party in the county, who was a former, he tells me at the end of this interview, oh, by the way, I was a German history professor. I knew he was a dean of a university, but he tells me at the end of the interview, my academic specialty was German history, and I'm terrified. I think we're going the way of the Weimar Republic here. And he gives me this list of things that scare him about the state of American democracy. And I included his testimonial in that story. And I just basically told the story of this town. I told the story of a woman who supported Trump, a waitress who was afraid to say it because she would be detested by her colleagues. And she just kind of kept her politics to herself at work. Yet she was willing to sit for an interview with me and brought her entire family to the interview, which is another thing about Americans. They love to be interviewed. It's one of my favorite things about working in the United States is if you pop a microphone under an American's chin, and very often they'll be willing to share their life story within minutes, including stuff that's very sensitive, right? Like the fact that there are tensions at work with colleagues over political choices. And one thing that members of her family told me about, again, this fear of Black Lives Matter, fear of racial mobs. And I realized the degree to which this racial animus and tension is at the heart of so much of the country's politics, even if people don't talk about it. It could be a discussion about healthcare, gun control, which this is one of the reasons I told that story about the West Virginia coal miner. It could be a story about climate change, and somehow it ends up becoming racialized. So, I've been shocked by the degree to which, in conversations with people over the last few years, folks will casually bring up the idea of a race war, or a civil war, and it's like this. I mean, this is not stuff people were saying in interviews a few years ago. Something has happened. Things have gotten a lot more intense in this country's politics, and it's just sped up after the election. And it's not really, again, like one of the reasons I told the story also about Appalachia is it's not a North versus South thing or East versus West. A lot of the times we sort of think of American politics in terms of large geographic blocks, and it's not that so much as cities versus the countryside, with the suburbs as kind of the front line in that political struggle. And that's tied up, obviously, again, in questions of culture and racial diversity. And so, I want to talk about technology for a second, because I think that communications technology has a role to play in this. It's one of the reasons that we're having some of these conversations now. So I've seen the world change over the course of my career. And when I was at Concordia, I signed up for my first email account in the computer lab. It was a Hotmail account. And that was my first one. And I still remember that day in that computer lab. And after leaving Concordia, when I went to work at the Chronicle, I remember one of the conversations we had was whether we should install the internet there. And I suggested we should get the internet and should get emails, because I thought it was like, we work in communication, we should make it easier to communicate. Because I used to get sports agate. I get like the local standings for the sports teams, and they would get faxed to me. And the sports league would say, why am I still sending this to you by fax? It's 1999. And so the decision was made not to get the internet, and not to get email because of, or maybe it was just the internet. I don't remember about email. No, it must have been, no, we didn't have email. And the reason, again, was there's this fear of lack of productivity that would be created by us having access to the internet during the day. So sadly, the paper no longer exists, but the internet does. So I've seen a good side of that communications revolution. I definitely have. I think the quality of journalism today is generally better than it was when I started. I actually do believe that journalists are a lot more fearful of making mistakes, and because they know they'll get called on it. So very often what would happen in the old days is somebody makes an assumption, gets into the copy, the article gets trimmed, gets put in the library at the newspaper or the wire service where you work, and then someone else writes about the topic, and the same mistake gets into and no one these errors end up in the bloodstream and no one corrects it. Well, nowadays you'll get picked apart by an angry mob online calling you to task for it. And I think that there's a good element to that as well. It creates this sort of second guessing effect, whereas before you write something, just know that you might have to defend this thing. And I think that it also is just obviously opened up this vast universe of information available to us. When I was starting out, we'd sit at the desk and there'd be like the Canadian Encyclopedia and maybe encyclopedia set, World Encyclopedia, a couple of books of contacts, and that was it. Now you got Google. And so just the amount of information you have at your fingertips, including on your phone when you're out on assignment, it's mind-boggling, right? So that's the good side. On the other hand, I think that there have been a number of terrible effects, including the ones that I want to talk about today. The impact on communication, the impact on jobs as well in the sector. I do think there are many opportunities to write, probably more than ever before, but it's probably impacted the opportunities to get remunerated for writing because of the fact that so many sort of entry-level jobs have been squeezed out by the internet. And I also do think that it's created a dynamic where wealthier people have a leg up into the sector because you can handle a free internship. You can write for free on a blog for a while, whereas sort of the working class ethos of journalism, which used to definitely exist. Journalists thought of themselves as working class. Journalists, not many, like university education for journalists was relatively rare until recently. And so while there are pros and cons to all of this, one of the things that journalism used to have was a sensitivity to the plight of working people, which I do think has possibly been lost a little bit as the industry gets professionalized and as the working class type jobs at the lower end of the spectrum, the entry level, get squeezed out. So that's the part of the negative aspect to it. Another negative thing about the modern communications dynamic is kind of gets back to what I opened with and the conspiracism. I noticed something had changed in 2016 at the two conventions I covered, the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention. I saw the world going crazy at these two conventions, and it wasn't just the Republican one. So I covered so I'll just start with the Democratic Convention. So I was at that event where the day or two before the convention, maybe it was the day before, WikiLeaks dumped a bunch of Democratic Party emails onto the internet. Not to be confused with the Podesta leaks, which came in October, just before the election. This is July. And someone, according to US intelligence, it was Russian intelligence, hacked into the Democratic Party's emails and just dumped them all onto WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks published them on the eve of the convention, ensuring that Democrats would be angry at each other and at each other's throats throughout the convention. Because what you saw in those leaks was just a bunch of people from the Democratic Party complaining that Bernie Sanders was extending his primary battle too long. See, it was kind of distorted in the popular imagination as the Democratic Party being biased against Bernie Sanders from the beginning. Maybe it was. But that's not what those emails proved. What those emails showed was that people were frustrated that even after he was eliminated mathematically, he continued to fight, and it was just basically draining some of the momentum from the party, leading into a general election as the party was still fighting itself. So Democrats were kind of complaining about Bernie Sanders. That gets published on the eve of the convention, and it was like all hell broke loose in the convention. Everyone was angry. People walked out. And the stuff I heard from people, right? The first time I ever heard about conspiracy theories involving voting machines was not this year from Donald Trump and his allies. It was from Bernie Sanders supporters in 2016 at this convention. People walked out. They were angry. People were angry at the press. And the stuff I heard about like deep state style theories, here it was the first time I sort of said, okay, the mainstream is not so mainstream anymore. This is the Democratic Party convention, and it sounds like a message board on the internet. And that is not to be conflated with the Republican convention that year, which was something. That the first time I ever heard the chant "Lock her up," I was there. The first time that chant was ever uttered in reference to Hillary Clinton, "Lock her up," and thousands of people chanting "Lock her up," was a speech by Michael Flynn to that convention. And I was sitting up in the stands right behind Flynn, watching a crowd of Americans talk about the jailing of a political opponent, thinking this is just completely nuts. And Michael Flynn goes on to become the national security advisor to the president of the United States for about a month because he got knocked out over issues that we'll not get into today. It's a long story. But basically, he becomes the top national security and foreign policy official in the White House, national security advisor. You know what he does today? He has a website that sells products, including QAnon gear, right? He's tweeted support for QAnon, this conspiracy theory about a child eating and molesting cabal by satanic deep state operatives. This person was the top national security official in the White House. And so 2016 to me was a real turning point, right? Things had changed. And, you know, history has shown us that new communications technologies often cause periods of chaos. You know, the telegraph, when Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, he was of the opinion that it could bring the United States together. There's a school of thought that says it caused the Civil War. And within a few years, what's happening is little controversies, what would have been controversies in a pre-telegraph era that would have taken days to report, are suddenly pinging back and forth between cities and everyone's angry at each other. Case in point, John Brown's raid on the federal weapons depot about an hour west of here, a beautiful town called Harper's Ferry. It's a lovely town, and I strongly encourage anyone to visit it if you ever have the chance, if you're ever in Washington. It's beautifully preserved. It looks like it did in that era. So this man, who today would be considered a hero, John Brown, was an abolitionist who led this raid on Harper's Ferry to steal the weapons from the federal munitions depot there and to distribute it to enslaved people and people who wanted to free them, to rebel against slavery at the time. Now, in the North, again, the speed of communication is accelerating, and people in the North see him as a hero. People in the South see him as a villain. He's ultimately executed. And the outrage over his execution in the North and the outrage over the outrage in the South is some of the fuel that helps lead to the Civil War. Another example, the beating of Charles Sumner, a member of Congress, a senator who was an abolitionist senator, is beaten in the head with a cane to within an inch of his life. The North is outraged over this. The South is angry at the North, and it just accelerates the passions of the era. And before too long, you're at war, and the country is killing itself. You know, in the radio era, Nazis referred to it as the eighth grade power. That there was a type of politician in the 1920s that capitalized on the existence of radio in the 1930s. That capitalized on the existence of radio, and a certain type of politician thrived. And you know, the Nazis were quite explicit about the power of radio in their anti-democratic and fascistic overthrow of the constitutional order of Germany. So I've been thinking about a speech by Al Gore about this topic, which I covered 20 years ago in Quebec City. He had just lost the 2020 presidential election. The 2000 presidential election. And he visits Quebec City in 2001. He leads a speech off with a joke. He says, "I'm Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States." Well, the thing that I remember most about that speech is his very optimistic view of the internet and what it would mean. He said that the same way the printing press led to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which led to the creation of the nation state, Treaty of Westphalia. So the same way it's inconceivable today as a result of that Reformation and that, the Treaty of Westphalia. The same way it's inconceivable today that Venice would go to war against Florence. Perhaps the internet will make it so that it's inconceivable that nations will go to war, with each other one day, that we are entering a period of prolonged global peace. At the time, I thought, well, that's wonderful. That's really nice. That's a brilliant idea. I hadn't, thought of that. Today, when I think of that speech, I say, wait a second, Al Gore skipped the entire bloody century before that Treaty of Westphalia. The printing press, led to the Protestant Reformation, yes, but it also led to an extreme period of violence. So sometimes I fear that the current innovations we're dealing with, we haven't yet figured out how they fit into our democracies and whether our democracies can peacefully coexist with them and how we make them coexist. So, one of the good things, I think, the aftermath of the January 6th Capitol attack, I think, has turbocharged this conversation about what do we want to do with these social media tools. I mean, there are very few people still saying just leave it alone and just let the laissez-faire attitude prevail, including death threats, including misinformation that undermines democracy. But there's a really intense debate going on, and I think it's picked up certainly in Washington. And I think that the results of this debate in Washington are going to spread around the world. I don't think, these companies mostly were created in the United States, and they will mostly hew towards the regulatory standards established here. And I think that the effect will spill over into the way they carry themselves in many places. So I think this matters tremendously to Canadians as well. One of the things that the parties are talking about, and I think there's support for both parties for this concept. I don't know whether it'll happen, but there's this talk about stripping what's called Section 230 immunity from these websites. Section 230 is an element embedded in the Communications Decency Act of 1994, I think. Don't hold me to the exact year, but it's the early 90s. And the idea was it would help the internet develop. And part of the principle behind it is you cannot sue a social media company for the content on its platform. You can sue the person who says it. So if somebody spouts a conspiracy theory, if someone calls you a member of a QAnon cabal, if someone says, oh yeah, your Dominion voting systems, your machines were rigged, you stole the election on behalf of Hugo Chavez and the Chinese government and God knows whatever else you're saying. Well, in the old days, you could sue the newspaper that published that. You could also sue the person saying it. And that kind of kept everyone a little bit more cautious, right? Well, the thinking was, well, you want to allow these platforms to develop. So they gave them, US lawmakers gave them liability protection, and elements of that have ended up in the new North American trade agreement. So you can sue, and frankly, Dominion Voting Machines has sued a few people close to the president who've accused them of rigging the election. You can sue someone for saying stuff about you, but you can't sue Twitter, you can't sue Facebook, you can't sue Google for the stuff that appears on those sites. Well, I do think that there is a bit of a movement within both political parties to strip away those liabilities. Republicans are angry at these social media companies because they feel that they were biased against President Trump and biased against Republicans, and so they want to punish them. Democrats say, you know what, we're being primarily hurt by these conspiracy theories. It's like the stuff that's being spread here that's undermining the democracy is primarily coming from people close to the president. We're very happy to strip these liabilities away from these companies. Again, I'm not sure it's happening, but it's an important debate to follow, and it'll have repercussions for people working in this field, in our field, for decades to come. So, I said that what happens here affects Canada. I don't know whether the political instability that we're seeing in many countries is going to ultimately spill into Canada. I'd like to believe not. The United States the United States has its own circumstances. The politics of this country is extraordinarily polarized between two parties, right? In Canada, there are multiple parties. If you're not happy with the Conservative Party, you can, vote to its right, or to the Liberal Party to its left. If you're not happy with the Liberal Party, you can move to the Green Party or NDP, or to the Conservative Party if you're a center left or centrist voter. There are more options. This country's politics has basically devolved into like two warring camps. It's the Capulets and the Montagues. So that dynamic doesn't totally exist in Canada. Another thing that that makes this country unique. So there's a history of racial polarization in politics, a history of cultural polarization, a rural versus urban polarization. There are hundreds of millions of guns in this country. After the January 6th attack on the Capitol, when I was walking in the neighborhood a couple of days later, it looked like a fortress. I mean, just fences went up everywhere, and people were terrified that someone might take a shot at a member of the inaugural event, at the president-elect or the vice president-elect or one of the other people in the line of presidential succession. People had to be vetted. Members of the National Guard were put there to defend against anyone in the crowd, and the members of the National Guard had to be vetted. And some people were kicked out of the event from the National Guard because they were afraid that they'd been radicalized online. So I think some of those factors are unique. You've had intelligence analysts in the United States warn for years that the proliferation of weapons, the polarization of the country, and frankly, hundreds of thousands of people returning from foreign wars with combat experience who were being recruited by militia groups, it was a recipe for disaster. Militia participation just skyrocketed after 2008, 2009, after the recession and the election of Barack Obama. First Black president, and just militia participation goes through the roof afterwards. And there were people from those militias in that crowd. So what did I see in that crowd? So I first of all, I did not join the group breaking into the Capitol for a couple of reasons, including the fact that I am a guest in this country. If I commit a crime, I am deported. So I said, I probably best not doing anything that could be construed as break and enter. So I stayed on the outside, and I watched events unfold from the outside. And there were essentially three concentric circles of activity. At the hub of this activity, there are people breaking into the Capitol, some of them holding flex cuffs, which are used to restrain people. So anyone who calls it just a riot, I believe, is understating the objectives of some of the people in that crowd. There are people who went in there, I believe, with the intention of let's just say, at the very least, restraining people on the inside. So you had people going there. Yeah, I saw lots of people dressed in camouflage and tactical looking gear, and I don't know whether they got them at military surplus stores, but bulletproof vests and military helmets with walkie-talkies and some communications devices in their ear or are strapped onto their lapel. These are folks who have some training, and I'll just leave it at that, right? And there are in the arrest sheets now show that a lot of the people arrested have military backgrounds, police, law enforcement backgrounds. So that's what I saw: a number of people breaking into the Capitol, tearing down bits of the stand, the inaugural stand that was going to be used for the inauguration. I guess where the lights and cameras were going to be for the inauguration. Putting up Trump flags there. Some media equipment was smashed. Journalists were threatened. Somebody spray painted "Murder the Media" on a door inside the Capitol. Several of my colleagues have been killed, or our colleagues have been killed not too far from here. There's a newspaper in Annapolis where there was a mass shooting a few years ago. So anyway, that's kind of what I noticed at the immediate hub of the activity. Second, a larger circle of people is people on the outskirts of the Capitol, encouraging others to get closer, just standing by the window. I saw a guy on a bullhorn saying, "This is our house. Come on in, people. This is your house. Join us upstairs." So there's this group, I guess you call them agitators or folks on the periphery of the first group. And then there's the much larger group of people, peacefully protesting, just standing there saying the election was stolen and we want it back. As erroneous and conspiratorial as that belief may be, I didn't see them doing anything violent. They're just standing on the lawn. I saw people showing baby pictures off their phones to each other. I saw, a group of women crying. I referred to this earlier. Women and men, but mostly women in this group who were praying, and one was splayed out on the grass in a moment of prayer, just basically lying down, and people were crying just basically for Donald Trump to remain president. And people with signs. I heard one person say, this morning Democrats took the Senate because they just won 2 seats in Georgia. Democrats won control of the Senate the previous night, morning, and they said Democrats just took the Senate. Well, we took it back this afternoon. And that's thousands of people on the outskirts of this crowd. So those are the three groups I saw. I don't know what happens next. I'm watching this incoming administration. One of the first things it's going to do, so it's passed a whole bunch of executive orders. This stuff could be transformational, but of course, executive orders are kind of written in water paint in a way, right? Because the next administration can come in and undo them. Courts can throw them out more easily. The more durable change in American governance occurs in law, right? And the very first important law that the Biden administration has proposed, I think there's two. One is a COVID relief bill, but the first that it's personally said, here's what I want to see. That would be long-term change to the country, is an immigration bill, and we can get into the specifics of that if anyone's interested. But immigration is probably the issue that arouses passions among Republican voters more than any other. And this is something Donald Trump recognized early on. If you look at quotes from him after the 2012 election, he said something to the effect of, well, Mitt Romney didn't show enough heart on immigration. We need to be more, like, he's basically said we need to be more tolerant on immigration. And the mood of the party was so anti-immigration reform, so anti-modernizing the country's immigration laws to normalize the status of millions of people. Basically, 11, 12 million people live in the United States without papers. And the big talk over the last generation has been, well, what's the longer term plan for this? How do we make sure that there are not 12 billion people living here without official papers? And usually the consensus or the argument that most people who want to reform the laws make is, okay, we got to do two things. Number one, provide status to these people who are here. Number two, increase security measures to keep to ensure that we don't have the same issue again in 10 years. Well, President Biden's put out a series of proposals to normalize the status of these individuals, but hasn't made any proposals on security. I think he's waiting for Republicans to make a counter proposal, and they can come to some sort of agreement. That's the way the system's supposed to work. However, the American politics gets so heated when immigration comes up. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't know whether it's going to stay sane, rational for the next 4 years. I think that we may be entering a period where what we saw on January 6th was a warning of what was ahead, not the worst of what was behind us. As someone who lives here and cares about this country, I hope that that's not true. I hope that this country, that it finds stability, peace, and coexistence. But I think that there are reasons to be concerned. So, these are serious times, and I want to bring this back to journalism school. And when I entered this business, the Berlin Wall had just fallen. This is the biggest fear as I was starting off in journalism was the Y2K bug. Really, that was the big scary story of 1998, 99. This idea that computers would melt on January 1st, 2000. It didn't happen. Then came 9/11. Then came major foreign wars. And these are much more difficult times than the ones that I entered journalism in, which means that those of you who want to work in this profession have a great responsibility on your shoulders. You'll be chronicling some important and difficult stories at home and abroad, and all these things are kind of connected at the end of the day. And so, you'll be telling these stories. I can't wait to read them. But I want to say a lot of things have changed since I was in journalism, and I've gone through a few of those things that have changed. One of the things that hasn't changed is the value of knocking on every door you possibly can. So just to go back to that day that I got visited from someone at the link, somebody handed out a sheet of paper, and had I ticked news but not sports, or a different combination of boxes, I might not have gotten that call that changed my life. And that just to me is a reminder that you at this stage in your career, tick every box you can, call every person you can. and knock every door that you can. And you don't know which one's going to open. It could take you to Washington. It could take you to Ottawa. It could take you to interesting places in your own community. But it starts with just trying as many things as you can at first. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thanks so much, Alex, for speaking. So like Alex said, we're going to open it up now to questions. If you guys have any about his experience in Washington or anything at all.
Okay, I got one for you, if you're willing.
Hi.
So I'm from Colorado, and as you know, we have that quackadoodle senator that just came in, Lauren Boebert or something like that. And there's so much coverage of her specifically because she says this thing, or she says that thing, or she committed this crime, or she didn't commit this crime, or what have you. My question is, with everything being editorial, how you cover or why you cover, how do you decide whether to include coverage for it all? Because giving her credence is an editorial decision.
That is a great question. And as a little bit of personal trivia, I've eaten at her restaurant. So she's got a restaurant in a place called Rifle, right? And and her restaurant is Second Amendment themed. And so everyone is armed. All the waitresses have guns, and the waiters, actually, I think it's just waitresses, if I recall correctly. But everyone basically has a gun in a holster. And I visited the place to use it as a kind of basically just as a lead point into a story about gun control debates and how the gun rights conversation was going in the U.S. This was in 2014. I had no idea she was running for Congress, nor did I know that she would fight for the right to bring guns onto the floor of the House of Representatives, which is what she's doing now. You know, I don't know. I have a good answer for you because I'm of two minds. On the one hand, maybe we should be giving more space to people who have, you know, views within the mainstream, ideas about how to introduce legislation that has a chance of passing, and not always the fringiest, you know, wackiest idea, you know, like whether members of Congress should have guns. On the other hand, it is undeniable where the current energy in the Republican Party is, and so I'm kind of torn. On the one hand, yeah, you know, who's worth covering more? Like Peter Meyer, a recently elected member from Grand Rapids, which is where I told you about a trip to Kent County where I saw the folks almost in a fist fight on the street. He's the new member of Congress from there. He voted to impeach Trump. He's also very eloquent, very, very interesting guy. Does he deserve more coverage, or does the person who represents a larger chunk of the Republican Party deserve more? I don't know. I don't know if there's a great answer to your question. What I do think is I try to avoid gratuitous coverage of stuff that's just the dumbest thing that gets said on any given day. But I think, for instance, if I'm doing a story on sort of the populist energy in the Republican Party, I'm not going to quote someone saying, "Yeah, I think QAnon is real." And then so, you know, he said, she said. I'm not going to quote someone saying, "Yeah, I'm going to impeach Joe Biden," because actually Marjorie Taylor Greene has put forward impeachment articles on Joe Biden already. You don't cover the wackiest things devoid of context. What you do is you write a story about that particular movement within the Republican Party, then assess whether it has any chance of succeeding. You include other voices. And I think that's the responsible way to do it, is you put it in its proper context, and you don't chase every single crumb dropped on the yellow brick road of American democracy. You pick your spots, basically. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry if it's not a perfect answer, but does that answer your question? Or?
Well, there is no true answer to it. I just wanted to know.
Yeah, it's tough. It's not easy. Yeah.
I'm just happy they stopped putting Colorado in her name. It's given us a bad name. They started putting it lower down that she's from Colorado.
It's a beautiful part of the state too, because that's where the mountains meet the desert, kind of like that's the Rifle is where the Rockies turn into basically the Southwest. It's really a beautiful, beautiful place.
If does anyone? Oh, yep, go.
So it's kind of a question off that, what Grayson said. It's more, how could journalists have dealt with Donald Trump and his sensationalistic comments and everything that he kind of to get elected, how could they have better dealt with the movement that he was creating? Because a lot of people say that the media, also how they responded, helped to further inflame
Yeah.
his popularity. So
Yeah.
I just wanted your take on that.
So I think some of the mistakes in the coverage of Donald Trump occurred very early on. The worst mistakes, I think, occurred early, where people assumed it was just a stunt campaign, right? He didn't have a base. He didn't have a following. In June of 2015, he held an event at Trump Tower in New York City, and I think there were some people paid to be there. It was not. He didn't have a mass following, but he said stuff that was so over the top. Plus, he was famous to begin with, right? Like somebody very famous runs for president, and then so a lot of the media. And I remember a conversation I had with my own editor that day. I said, "This is nuts. Like what?" But what should we do with this? I mean, do we ignore it? No, you can't really ignore it. It's somebody really, really famous said he's running for president, and the stuff he said is over the top. But you also kind of like want to put it in its context. This is somebody who's not a serious candidate for president at the time, people assumed. So I remember the way I dealt with it is I said the top 10 weirdest moments of Donald Trump's first press conference. So I think a lot of people saw this and either laughed or thought it was crazy or thought, well, whatever, this is very nice. He's going to go back to running a real estate and branding business, and this will be over in 2 weeks. I went away on summer holiday that year. So I went to get married, and come back from the wedding, and he's in first place. And I was like, and so one of the things that had happened, two things happened. Number one, I think he tapped into a willingness to say things that no one else was willing to say, especially on immigration and racial issues. And I've just described how I think it was disingenuous. I don't think he believed half of it, because back in 2012, he was saying we need to be friendlier on immigration because that's why we lost. That's why Mitt Romney lost. He changed his mind totally when he realized, well, that's where the mood is in the party. I think I need to say this now. And boy, did it ever work. But this didn't work in a vacuum. I was covering events, the CPAC conference. It's an annual, not to be confused with Canada's CPAC television network. There's an annual Conservative Political Action Conference event. And I remember the one before Trump ran for president. Speaker after speaker was talking about terrorism. And the line at the time was, from the Republican Party, was Barack Obama's too scared to say the word Islamic or Muslim, right? And it was this weirdest thing, like this belief that if you just say it's Muslim or Islamic terrorism, that'll solve the problem. So every speaker at this conference was basically talking about, we're not going to be scared to say radical Islamic terror. And people were cheering, like radical Islamic terrorism was an applause line. And I was like, well, that's weird. And at the same time, you have people, including very serious people in the party, saying they couldn't confirm whether or not they thought Barack Obama loved America. So there's this strain of nativism happening at the time, and then everyone's trying to tap into it, as I just described. I'm talking about people like Scott Walker was saying the stuff I was talking about at the Conservative Political Action Conference, and quite a few candidates for president. So everyone's kind of trying to tap into it. But then someone shows up on the scene and says, oh, I'll show you how to tap into it. I'm not going to have any compunction whatsoever. And then Trump comes in and he speaks to an audience that's there. And I come back from holiday, he's in first place. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened, and this is the mistake that I think media might have made at first, mainstream press initially, was to give him so much attention at the very outset. Another thing I remember from just before leaving on that holiday, or maybe it was just after, I don't recall exactly, but Hillary Clinton was giving a speech, and there was two screens on CNN. Hillary Clinton's screen of her speaking was muted, and it was small. And Donald Trump was going to give a speech, and he was late, or it was starting later, in an empty podium from a Trump speech or press conference. So basically an empty Donald Trump podium took up this much space on the screen, and Hillary Clinton, actually speaking, a serious candidate for president, was being muted out because this guy was a better ratings draw. And I think that's kind of what happened early on. But frankly, I don't think there's anything that could have been done afterwards from the press. I don't think there's a whole lot that could have been done differently because, frankly, half the country is not listening to the press anyway, right? And so, and this gets back to the information bubbles phenomenon I'm talking about. When people believe that the vice president of the United States is participating in a satanic child-eating cabal and he's working in cahoots with China to overthrow the U.S. government, what am I going to say to change that person's mind?
Mhm.
So that's the risk. Other than just doing our job as professionally and diligently as I can, and speaking to whoever who wants to be spoken to, and basically also, doing our due diligence and investigating some of the things that get said that are clearly wrong and crazy. I live a few, a couple of metro stops away from a pizzeria, Comet Ping Pong, which is the QAnon conspiracy theory kind of started there. It's a neighborhood pizza joint, or not only pizza, but it's a restaurant up Connecticut Avenue. And this rumor got started in 2016 that it had a pedophilia ring in the basement. And this is the precursor. This is what led to QAnon. And somebody showed up there with a gun to kill people, or at the very least to take it over. And he realized when he got there, he said, there was no basement. There was no basement, let alone a pedophilia ring in the basement. And he apologized. He said, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I didn't know. But yet that became the impetus for QAnon. And I don't know. I don't know how many times we can write that it's not true or something's not real. But to get back to your question about Trump, I think most reporters have done the best job they can. But any mistakes that got made were early on, when he may have gotten more attention than a 4th or 5th place candidate deserved, right? Because at the beginning he was just kind of a novelty candidate, but before too long he's in first place and he's the dominant force in the Republican Party.
Sorry, I have
A question.
I'll just ask one follow-up question. How many
Sure.
articles do you write? Because I see that a lot of my other coworkers, they write 5, 6 articles a day. I just wanted to know, how many articles do you have to write at your job?
Yeah, well, it depends on what kind of article you're writing, and so I used to write 5 or 6 a day when I worked at the Chronicle newspaper. What I tend to do now is longer term features. And sometimes I'll write a few in a day, or contribute to a few in a day. So it's not an easy answer to your question because I don't work by myself, right? So I work with teams of people. So we have people in Ottawa, we have people across Canada, we have other people in Washington. So I might contribute to an article. I might do some research or get a phone call, get a quote, and I'll share it with someone who's writing the rest of the story. So sometimes I might contribute to a couple stories in a day, but sometimes I'll also take a few days to work on something. It's taken me over a week sometimes to write an article. Sometimes I've chipped away at stuff, in the background, like you work on one story during the day, but you sort of take some notes or do some research for a later story. And you keep a front burner and back burner story, and the back burner story you keep going for days or weeks or even months sometimes, and you finish it later. So to answer your question, generally I usually write a few stories a week, features, and sometimes I'll write a few in a day or contribute to a few in a day, and it really does vary. Right now I'm interviewing young people who got to stay in the United States under the DACA program. So in the United States, I referred to 11 million people here without without legal documents. There are 650,000, I think, young people who have documents because they were brought here from their parents or a guardian below a certain age, and the Obama administration created basically a program to defer their deportation. You can't cancel their deportation because it would be illegal because the law says they have to be deported. So what Obama did is he created a DACA program that says, okay, we're not going to deport them right away. In the meantime, let's give them the right to work. Let's create a social security number. Let's allow people to get a driver's license, to go to school legally. And this program was created by Obama. It was challenged in court. It could have been canceled, but it survived one particular court challenge to the Supreme Court. It's undergoing other challenges. It was canceled by Donald Trump, right? So Trump said he wanted to cancel the program, but he never quite finished the cancellation because of these court challenges. So I've interviewed these young people who basically, for whom the election was a life-altering experience. It's like, imagine, we all care about elections, but imagine watching an election saying, if this person wins, I may stay in the country I've been in since I was 1 or 2. If this person wins, I may have to go to a place I don't even know or don't even speak the language necessarily. I'm doing a story on their lives, and so those interviews take a while. I mean, I've interviewed a bunch of them, plus also experts on the program. So that's not something you would do 4 or 5 of in a day. So it depends on the story you're doing. So just to answer your question, yeah, it varies.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Hey.
Hi. So I work at Global News as a cameraman and video editor. I started there about 5 years ago. And since Trump has been in power in Montreal, and since Trump has been in power, I've noticed more incidents with people, people yelling fake news, people starting problems with me for doing my job. And in the past 10 months since the pandemic started, it's gotten much worse. Just being out there, people getting upset because you're filming. Working in the US, I mean, you work as a writer, right? Mostly?
Yeah.
Have you noticed an increase of incidents as well? You want to talk a little bit about what it's like to deal with that?
Sure. So nothing specific has happened to me, but things are happening to people. What you're describing is absolutely a phenomenon that's occurring. And I think there are 3 things happening at once, right? One is you described the Trump phenomenon. I think it's definitely part of it. If you look at public opinion polling on respect for the press as an institution in the United States, it was kind of for a while, it was kind of nonpartisan-ish. I mean, there was all a partisan gap for a long time, but it really started to accelerate after the Iraq War, which is crazy now because the people who say that journalists are the enemy of the people now are saying we're supposedly on the side of the globalists who want to invade other countries. But I'm like, wait, one of the reasons you dislike the media is 10 years ago, they were calling out the Iraq War. So anyhow, that's an aside. But that gap just completely takes off after 2016, right? Donald Trump single-handedly, because he saw a market, right? Immigration skeptical or anti-immigration market, media bashing, like this. When he would talk smack about the press, he got lots of cheers, and he just kept it up. And so you look at sort of Republican support for the press; it's just gone into the gutter the last few years. That's one thing that's happened. Second thing that's happened is I was talking about the class difference. It is undeniable that during the COVID-19 pandemic, white collar workers who can sit on their their desks. I was going to say sit. I'm online. I was going to sit on their butts at home and work off a laptop, off the computer, which I am often doing myself. Have had a much easier pandemic than people who have either lost jobs in the service industry or gotten sick. But I think what's happened is, again, going back to this idea of the press being now increasingly a white collar type of job, it's maybe lost its connection with people who have lost the ability to pay their mortgage and rent over the last 10 months. And those people are angry at the press for all this talk of lockdowns. And I think that the press is generally supportive of measures to avoid the spread of the virus. I think we've covered and written about the need for social distancing. But I think a lot of people say, look, I have bigger problems now than the virus. I'm afraid of losing my home. So that's fueled a little bit more frustration with the press. And then there's social media and other things at play. But to answer the question about what I've seen. So, I just referred to the shooting, like a mass shooting of journalists not too far from Washington, D.C. And I fear that there could be more. I saw, murder the media spray painted in a room inside the Capitol building the other day. I was at a Trump rally. So, by the way, one thing I should say before, I'll preface this story with because sometimes I think we focus on the negative, but I want to sort of make clear that the vast majority of interactions I've had with Trump supporters and with Americans in general are extremely friendly. Americans, like I said earlier, love to tell their stories. And so, especially if you say you're a foreign reporter, yeah, I'm with, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or I'm with, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. People are delighted to talk to foreigners, ask you questions about your country. So generally, it's quite friendly. That being said, there definitely is an undercurrent of tension now that didn't exist before, or it's gotten worse with the press. I was at a Trump rally back in December in Georgia, and there were people heckling and harassing the Fox News guy in particular, the reporter from Fox News, because they were angry that they thought that Fox had betrayed Trump on the aftermath of the election. And when we left the event, I have to say, I was a little nervous about being basically part of a media group wandering through a crowd of thousands of people. Inside the event, it's fine. There's, you're in your own area. You're talking to people if you want to talk to them. And it's kind of like everyone kind of does their own thing. But as you're leaving, what happened was we went to the press bus, and some folks from the White House were saying, okay, media down there, media in that bus, just basically wrangling us into the place where the bus was that would take us away from the scene of the rally, which was at an airport hangar outside of a town in southern Georgia. So the White House folks are like, press bus there, media in that bus. You have to be media to be in that bus. And they keep saying it. I'm like, it's okay. You don't have to keep repeating it. We get the point. So as I'm getting on the bus, there's a truck, it's a pickup truck that just stuck in traffic behind us. And one guy started screaming, saying, fake news. And then all the people in the truck saying, that's the fake news bus over there. And trying to whip up the crowd, going outside and saying, that's the fake news bus. And then staring at us with like rage in his eyes, pulling a gesture with one of the fingers in the hand that I'm not going to do on camera here, and screaming, F you, like angry, like basically, because in his mind, the media have conspired with, whether it's the Chinese government or the QAnon cabal that keeps getting, or whatever, to overturn a democratic election in his mind. And in his mind, that makes us an enemy. And so when I was at the rally, when I was at the Capitol on January 6th, we had most news organizations, larger ones, had security people to work with their teams. Because cell phone connections were down, it wasn't easy. One thing, in a large crowd, cell phones don't work very well, right? So I get there and I couldn't connect with the security team. I said, well, you know what? I wandered into the crowd anyway. And I said, I just took notes. And I did not interview anyone that day, because I said, you know what? I'm supposed to be with the security team. I haven't connected with those folks. Let me kind of split the difference here. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to go, I'm not going to do interviews. What I'll do is I'll just take out my phone, take pictures, and write notes from the things I'm hearing around me. Because I think that, I hadn't managed, like I said, I hadn't managed to connect with the team that was provided for me. Second of all, I wasn't surprised when a few hours later I saw journalistic equipment being destroyed and journalists getting, roughed up, because definitely the potential was there.
Matthias, I think. Oh,
yeah, sorry. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't before anyone. Just in terms of, looking forward with the next 4 years with Joe Biden's administration, how do you think the American media ecosystem could maybe work towards reparating their reputation in the United States? Maybe not necessarily with the hardcore QAnon folks, but maybe with the more sort of right-leaning people who don't believe in, say, CNBC anymore, or don't believe in these legacy media. How do you think they could work towards keeping the current administration accountable and sort of fixing their reputation?
Maybe one of the things is to sort of get back to the stuff that I was referring to earlier, the concerns of working class people. And I hate to pander. I don't want to basically be one of those folks who says, well, Donald Trump supporters and the people who stormed the Capitol were all the downtrodden working class, which is not true. By the way, a lot of the people who are arrested are very well-off people or professional individuals, and they're not exactly taking a break from the crew at lunch, to come to storm that building. So I just want to make clear that I'm aware that this is not, the entirety of the story. But I think part of what's fueling sort of the animus towards the press is this belief that it's speaking to a closed circle of people who already share the worldviews of, upper middle class, college educated, city dwelling members of the culture, the political culture that consume mainstream media. So maybe one of the ways of breaking down some of those barriers is to examine some of the stories of concern to people outside of that, right? maybe stories about the costs of pandemic lockdowns. Maybe we didn't tell them as well as we could have. Maybe we can tell them more. Maybe we can talk to people about the struggles to pay the mortgage as a result of the measures that very often we've been advocating for. Our news organizations have been spending a lot of time promoting. But just basically to hear those people, even in coverage of immigration, right? There's one of the things that has changed a little bit, because the issue has gotten so polarized that just 10, 12 years ago, you had folks like Barack Obama saying, look, you can't have unfettered open borders, because if you do, that could drive down wages, because you have people coming in and working for much less. And I've seen it too, just even in the construction industry, people who, say that, well, I can't compete with the salaries that people who don't have documents are charging for work. So it's putting people out of work. So there's this competitive wage pressure. And there are actually studies on this, and I'm not like, there's been an economist called Borjas has written about this. There's different schools of thought about whether that's accurate or not, but that's a way too detailed economic conversation that I'm not ready to have today. But one of the things is, this is something that people are wondering about, and that there is an economic argument for certain protections on the border. Maybe a fair way to cover that issue is also to make sure that you hear some of that too, and then some of that gets into your stories, and it's not just boosterism on one side or the other, without pandering, without pandering to bigotry, without pandering to conspiracism, but to hear everybody, including the concerns of people you wouldn't hear about in your own social circle because you live in a city, or you live with people who kind of are like-minded, or hear from people who are like-minded to you. Maybe it's incumbent on us to sort of make sure that perspectives get into the copy that we may not hear on an everyday basis. I mean, and that's the best. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe it's worth a shot.
That does definitely answer my question. Thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions for Alex before we wrap it up?
Question that's more general.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the first one will be specific, is in wondering what the food was like at that Second Amendment restaurant. That's first thing I'm kind of wondering about. In terms of your own career, and I'm familiar with a lot of your coverage, so it's cool to speak to hear you speak today. And just wondering, and I'm sure the other people in the students could relate to this as well. Just hearing about the industry, and as you mentioned, the internet sort of wiping away so many entry-level jobs and such, and so much uncertainty around the profession, wondering as a person who's going into the field, navigating that uncertain space of precarious employment and entry-level jobs, what is sort of more valued? Is it having expertise in a certain area? For example, I have a background in education, but I don't want to have anything to do with that anymore, for example. Or just, clocking in hours, places, and getting experience. So in my mind, I'm not sure how to, there's sort of two different ways of approaching the same thing. I'm not sure. I was just wondering what your take is on how to best, what approach to take going forward. Sure.
So to answer your first question, I don't know why I remember this, but I remember I had some kind of guacamole burger. It was pretty good. It was called Shooter's Grill in Rifle, Colorado, the aptly named Rifle, Colorado. And so that's what I remember from that. To answer your other question, it's a very good one. It's good. You've identified one of the basic dilemmas: is you go for specialization or for generalization. So I think there are multiple paths there, right? One thing that's unfortunate is the earlier path I described has been narrowed, which is just come in to an entry-level job, make a bunch of mistakes, learn how to do this craft, and get paid a decent working class salary at the very start. That still exists, but it's just not as plentiful in terms of the number of opportunities that it used to offer. So that leaves you with a few options. Number one is, that's still available. There still are jobs in this industry, and it can happen. But there are other tracks that I would call kind of the fast tracks, right? Your best bet for finding work. One is to just be an out of the ordinary storyteller, just an extraordinary wordsmith and storyteller. If you're working on TV or in print, doesn't really matter. If you can tell a story better than anyone else, there will be work. And this is a very elite group of people. There aren't many people who can sort of just write their way to into an easy ticket. But if you're great at telling a story, there will be opportunities. Second is specialization. I think that one of the ways you get published on a blog or get pickup in social media is displaying an extraordinary amount of knowledge about something. And whether it could be military affairs, it could be economics, it could be poverty policy, it could be, again, social policy, urbanization, environmental issues, cap and trade and carbon taxes, and whether you know environmental policy. And basically, if you're really smart about something, somebody's going to want that information. And if enough people want that information and enough people are clicking on what you're writing, whether it's on a blog or on social media, there's a good chance that ends up as a job somewhere. So specialization. A third is cross-pollination of knowledge, right? So if you take two things and you put them together, you mentioned education. I'm trying to, an example that easily comes to mind, would be something like international relations and public policy, or international relations and political science. If you know international relations and political science, or defense policy, international relations and defense and political science, well, you walk into covering a debate in the House of Commons about whether it's forced labor in Xinjiang, China, and whether we should clamp down on goods made from forced labor from Uyghurs, whether you're covering a debate about what can be done, what different policy avenues we should pursue with Saudi Arabia, especially given the war in Yemen. I mean, you're just going to have an inside track that someone else who's never thought about these issues will have. And I think one of the best ways to cross-pollinate is to mix data journalism and narrative storytelling. I am pretty bad at data journalism, but I'm much better than I used to be. Thanks partly to my spouse. She has helped me learn how to at least use Excel and Google Sheets in a non-embarrassing way. But what that's done is allowed me to sort of look and say, okay, let me strip down the names of all the members of Congress, see who voted to impeach Trump on the Republican side, who didn't, and are they younger? Are they for more competitive districts? Are they newer in Congress? What does that tell us about the future of the Republican Party? Suddenly, your storytelling is enriched. You're telling a much more politically sophisticated story than something based on your own impression, right? And again, I'm pretty mediocre at this. But someone who's starting out, my advice would be learn how to do this stuff, because if you can learn how to visualize data and gather information on data, you're going to lay waste to the competition that doesn't. And especially if you can learn something else. So if you learn about politics, for instance, or urban planning or municipal governance, and then you learn how to find data on stuff happening in your city, put it together to tell a story, someone will want you. And so, like I said, those are some of the avenues: specialization, storytelling, and cross-pollination of knowledge. I think those things are ways that I would suggest you probably get an inside track.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Do we have any more questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we're talking before about the impact of technology, social media, Facebook, Twitter, all of this on the politics in the States. And without a doubt, I think we're about the same age. So I come from a time also before, the internet and all that was part of our everyday lives. How do you think things are going to go politically in the future with all these social media companies?
You mean so what they'll do to society, or what society and governance will do to them?
Either way, well, how do you see this going? I mean, we don't, like, is government, do you think they're going to maybe break up some of these companies with antitrust laws? Or do you think that maybe it's just going to continue and there's going to be, like they banned Trump on Twitter, which apparently has brought a lot of disinformation down now, but then there's other companies popping up. Where do you see it going? I mean, it's kind of wild now.
That is a great question. And frankly, I don't know. I mean, you just mentioned the antitrust thing, which I hadn't even brought up, but I think that's one of the conversations happening in the U.S. My advice would be to just kind of pay attention to the debate here, because I think, ultimately it spills over. And I think that, so the conversations, I think, are the antitrust one. The other one is Section 230. And then the some sort of protocol about who can you ban, who's allowed to be banned. Also, I think ultimately where we might be going is the need to reveal yourself online, or at least to reveal yourself to the company, and then you could post anonymously online. But a lot of this stuff, the most dangerous stuff in the lead up to January 6th and after, people talking about killing people, and to me, having grown up in journalistically before social media, it's just like, it's mind-boggling. Like, could you imagine writing to the Montreal Gazette, yes, I believe this person should be murdered. Like, it's crazy how we're living in the Wild West now. And I think years from now, we'll look back on this period and say this was an aberration. What I hope, and I think most people probably hope, is that it doesn't end up being seen as an aberration in terms of free speech. I think that you want to sort of preserve the good parts, but not, and I think one of the ways potentially of doing that is sort of like, if you want to have access to Twitter or Facebook or any, large platform, you at least have to identify yourself in the registration process, so you can be verified privately. But I mean, that's going to open up a bunch of other civil rights questions, because I heard this, like, I actually suggested this idea once online. I said, why don't, when you write a letter to the newspaper, you have to explain who you are. Like, the New York Times makes you prove who you are before you get published. Why can't we do that online? And someone had said, to me, well, that's ridiculous, because then you're going to basically make it impossible to be a dissident. Like, how could you be a Hong Kong dissident or anybody else? And so I'm sensitive to that, but part of me feels that's really, really wishful thinking, that's the battle we're fighting, because the countries where those that are living the situation that you described have just shut down those things, right? We're now fighting a rear guard action, defending the democracies that already exist, not breaking down new democratic barriers. So how do you preserve democracy? I think part of it is just having an accountability mechanism into the system, where if you say something illegal, hateful, violent, you can get in trouble. So that would be something that I think would be something worth looking at too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I might ask you a question. Maybe if there's no other questions, I'll ask a question to kind of end things. So Alex, what advice would you give to journalists now entering this field? Because we kind of live in a world where, several people have said in this chat that journalists have been labeled as the enemy for the last 4 years. And there's this new fake news movement that has started in the US and it's slowly has come to Canada. And now we're seeing it in Quebec. So what advice would you give to journalists now entering this field and having to face all this? Like, how do they enter this and not get discouraged of the work that they have to do?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is what I said earlier about feeling, if you're fighting for the little guy, and it's something that we do sometimes, and not always. Sometimes the stories we tell are from the perspective of people with power, but the ones that feel the best, are the ones where you're sticking up for people who don't have as much power. And I think that's part of the solution to the challenge that we're describing, because it builds trust. I think people respect people who give a voice to people who don't have a lot of power. The story that I feel proudest of in my life, I think, is I wrote pieces on Afghan interpreters, people who were working for the Canadian military, and they were afraid that they'd be killed when the Canadian government left Afghanistan. And so there was a series of events happened, and that ended up basically spurring a departmental conversation in the Immigration Department of Canada. And sort of, anyway, a program got created. I think there was a relationship between my story and that. I don't want to take credit for it, but it was part of the process that led to the creation of this program, and that it might have saved some lives. And that feels good. And I also find that when you make clear that you're listening to people, to ordinary people, people generally respect that, and it breaks down those walls of distrust. And I think that it also addresses some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, where journalists, to a certain extent, I think our people in our profession are disliked by a large number of people who see us not as tools of the oppressed and the powerless, but as tools of powerful. And whether it's fair or not, I mean, I think it might be fair sometimes, but I don't think it's always fair. But maybe one of the things we need to do is sort of remember that, look, you should also care about people who don't read the news, also care about people who don't have a college degree and are not thinking about the things you're thinking about or living the reality you live, and sort of get back sometimes to that lunch bucket, ethos that I think we may have lost a little bit for the economic and technological reasons I described earlier. But I think that'll sort of help to build at least some of the trust. I don't think we're not solving all the problems we've described, at least in the next few years, but maybe that'll help alleviate some of that. And so that's one piece of advice is, think about the little guy. I mean, just think about the person that, the old adage about journalism afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. Yeah, maybe we could do that a little more often. And another thing, like I said, advice for people breaking into the business is one of those paths: the great storytelling, or specialization, or learning two things that work well together that not a lot of people can do two things simultaneously of, especially if one of those two things involves technological prowess. I think that's a series of things I would advise people to consider if they were getting into the business.